Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to this week's segment of Ethical Perspectives on the News. Our topic today relates to the business of the news and the standards of the news media. My name is Martha Rogers, and it's so nice that we could spend some time together. I grew up in New England in a home where the newspaper business and sharing the news was our income. My dad worked in a newspaper for 47 years, and it was dear to me as I had jobs there too as I grew up. I started a long time ago revering news and honoring the newspaper business. The Daily came out and I got to learn how to proofread and set linotype machines and all those old-fashioned things with news. And the news has changed so much since then. But I also grew up knowing that the freedom of the press was one of our cherished traditions. But I also believe that the freedom to criticize the press is also a cherished tradition. And in preparing for this morning's taping, I came across a quote that I would like to share with you. It goes as this: "Our newspapers every day are loaded with accidents and casualties and crimes concerning people of whom we have never heard before and we shall never hear of again, the reading of which is no earthly use to any human being." So what is news? What is it that an intelligent public should care to hear about? Does that sound familiar? It does. It should. But surprisingly, those words were uttered on September 6, 1881, when Mr. Charles Dudley Warner presented a paper publicly. And my point in quoting him after all of these years is to prove that media criticism and change, I guess press in his time and media we can say in our time, it's an old and it's an honorable exercise to talk about the news and the press. So we have some panel of experts here today that I'd like to introduce to you that will help us explore some of these issues of standards in the news. Let me introduce them to you this morning. Seated next to me is Lyle Muller with Iowa Watch, and he'll explain to us a little bit more of that in detail. Welcome, Lyle.
Hello.
And next to Lyle is Professor Frank Durham, Associate Professor of Journalism and Mass Communication down at the University of Iowa, and I welcome you too, Frank.
Good morning.
And seated next to Frank is Todd Dorman. Todd's a columnist and editorialist with the Cedar Rapids Gazette. And welcome to you too, Todd.
Thanks.
Lyle, let's start with you. In preparing for this week's taping, I was interested in finding out a little bit about Iowa Watch, and I'm not sure many of our viewers would understand what Iowa Watch is. So.
Iowa Watch is part of the Iowa Center for Public Affairs Journalism. It's only a 5-year-old entity. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization that does investigative and in-depth explanatory journalism. And we do this as a public service. We think it's important in a democracy. The organization was started when we realized that a number of news media outlets were laying off people or eliminating some of the reporting jobs, so we thought a void existed. We do this in collaboration with other media, so more than 70 news organizations, including the Gazette, KCRG, WMT Radio in Cedar Rapids, KXIC in Iowa City, air or run our stories, and we provide them these stories free. There's a second component, and that is we train college students. We sit down side by side with college students, treating them as professionals, and work with them as mentors and editors to get their work up to a level that is good enough to be published anywhere in the world. And we teach them to try to attack this important work with a high journalistic and ethical standard. We want them to have strong ethics, we want them to be thorough, we want them to have the best standards of professionalism that can be possible.
And do they get some practical application of all that?
They get indeed practical application. So a number of their stories have appeared in newspapers across the state, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, the Des Moines Register, the Ames Tribune, Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, and it goes on and on. Also, they do reports for radio programs. We have a weekend radio program, and so students are doing reports for those programs. And they've also been able to explain their stories in a number of different media, including radio stations beyond those who are in our radio network.
Well, it's sure nice to know that exists just down the road. Congratulations for having that in Iowa. So I'm going to throw it out to all three of you. What is the news? He asked that publicly in 1881. What is news? When you have a student, Frank, come to you that wants to be a journalism major, what is news? Where do you start with that definition?
Well, these days I'm thinking a lot about the 100 years ago and the beginning of professional journalism, where facts were treated as a product of a kind of science-based logic. And so triangulation, verification, examination of evidence, the comparison of points of evidence to determine what facts were not only regarded by Walter Lippmann in the 1920s as the definition of truth. They were regarded as the basis of democracy, because if we could all agree on particular points of fact, we might be able to work from there in broader meaning.
Interesting. So do we bring the historical view forward and find it still applies to teaching journalism today and training news?
I think the field of journalism is in a much broader context. The internet has changed everything, and the claims that people make about being journalists may or may not correspond to the codes of ethics that we have from the Society of Professional Journalists or the Association of the American Society of News Editors, or other codes that we could talk about. The recent case of the University of Virginia sexual assault allegations that were published as news in Rolling Stone show that if you let go of professional standards, you can have a real crisis on your hands.
So there are professional standards that journalists are asked to adhere to. But then that gets into who has oversight of such standards, and is an editorial column like Todd's different than reporting news, and are there different? Talk to that a little.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, we, like reporters, try to gather facts, gather information, interview people. So a lot of the reporting techniques are similar to regular, I guess you would call standard, the non-biased journalism that most people would think of. But then we distill those facts into an opinion, or we try to form an opinion and impart that opinion to the public as an editorial, or in my case, a column. I mean, I've been a columnist for 7 years, and there's probably been so much change, I guess, in the way opinion journalism is presented, and a lot of pressure to sort of be more provocative, more outraged. I mean, that's sort of the standard now with a lot of folks out there writing opinion. You know, there's people that will joke that, give someone a dime, you'll get their opinion. I don't think you have to spend that much now. So we have to try to, keep sight of the journalistic standards that form reporting as we form our own opinions. But there's a lot of pressure to sort of chuck some of that and just sort of run with your outrage and run with whatever partisan or ideological viewpoint you might have.
So what are some of the standards that the press, the journalism area, the media are asked to stick by?
Well, one of the things is that your column is labeled as opinion.
Right.
And so there's a definition and a distinction both in its, the designation of what you're doing and the place in the newspaper, which is on the opinion and editorial pages. But when we move to cable news, which has a lot of time to fill, you get what is fairly called the journalism of opinion, and it's talk radio on television. And so there's a professional bent to your work, and your work is excellent. I really enjoy reading your column.
Thank you.
Every morning when you're published, and it's on my breakfast table. And so we designate and let our readers know when we're engaging in thoughtful and logical consideration of ideas versus the reporting of what should be fact.
There are standards of being fair, being honest, the pursuit of the truth, double checking facts, a standard of at least 2 sources to check your facts, to not misrepresent yourself. when you're developing a news story. So those are the types of standards that exist. But you asked the question about who oversees and enforces that, and the answer is nobody, because we have a First Amendment. The First Amendment guarantees a free press, and we all have this ability to seek the truth in the manner that we see fit, and also to be watchdogs and not have some sort of oversight on us. That's a real important tenet in the United States.
So some self-policing is a tool that has to be developed with anyone, then, I'm hearing you say, that works with news and journalism.
Yeah, there's self-policing, but also the public is a pretty good detector of what's going on out there, too. And this is where ethics really come into play, because in order for the public to have a fair opinion of the work you're doing, it's really important to take an ethical approach to what you're reporting so that people can trust you. Our biggest value as journalists is that people trust us. If we don't have trust, we can't accomplish our job. And so it's an important tenet for a real professional journalist to follow. Of course, you know, Frank mentions the internet, and there are a number of citizen journalists out there who are doing some kind of reporting of events as they see it. There are people who talk about it. I found it interesting that when I was going through the cable system that I have at home, when it flashed up explaining what Fox News does or MSNBC does, the explanation is they debate the news. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I don't know that you can debate the news. You can debate your feeling about the news. Right. But really, that is kind of the mindset that exists, is debating whether what we're being told is true or not.
Well, and I'm finding my own self reacting that some news stations or media outlets are presenting factual news as emotional reactions or sensationalism. And I know it's a business, and I know that there's ratings on the television media to try to vie and win for. But I like to get back to the facts, and how news to me is a factual reporting of an event.
So one of your question to me was, how do I explain what news is to a student who wants to become a journalist? And I think one of the ways that you can do that is to look at reporter-source relationships. Reporters ethically and professionally need to show their sources. They need to show their work in the course of a report. And so being able to understand where the information came from, as Lyle said, to have more than one source that's corroborating that development of what we consider to be credible fact is really very important. We also talk, though, about the responsibility of news consumers. The responsibility is not only on the production side of this relationship. I tell my students to read and to view and to listen to multiple reports and to see if the same sources show up, which they often do, sometimes for good, sometimes not, but to have a varied news diet so that they can be media savvy.
And to look at the various reports non-emotionally, to take in where the facts are lining up and corroborating each other and correlating with the actual events.
No, this is, I mentioned the sort of progressive notion of a scientific logic, but there should be a method that is detached, or disinterested is the term that we would use, so that you're comparing apples and apples, oranges and oranges, and you can have a fair confidence that the report you're being given is credible. Sometimes, and not infrequently, journalists make mistakes. And one of my favorite explanations in class is the correction. Because when newspapers and television stations and websites issue corrections, it demonstrates that they know the difference between a successful factual report and not accomplishing the same. And it shows us, in fact, that it's possible to achieve the truth.
I celebrate it when I hear a correction, because I then say we are looking for truth. And I worry about the pattern I see sometimes, and again, it's just my opinion that there's a pattern there, of that criminalizing those who have made errors. If it's made errors for just viewer ratings or for more subscriptions to magazines or newspapers, then I worry about it. But I really want to celebrate and hold up those who have reported the news and said, oh, we made a mistake. Even if it's 5 years later, I would like to know that they are worthy of standing up and building that trust relationship by saying, we have erred. And I hope we would see more of that.
Well, I think the New York Times issues about 4,000 corrections a year. So
I'm not talking about the little bylines. I'm talking more about what just happened with Fox News.
If our expertise is a function of our error, there you go.
As an editor, not an editor, an editorial opinion writer, how do you decide what's worthy? And that's a question that bothers me even for all news, is what makes a news story worthy enough to spin it, and who makes those types of decisions of putting it out there?
Well, at the Gazette, we have an editorial board, and we meet weekly to talk about, a lot of it's what's been in the news, what sort of stories have we had in the newspaper or in other media sources, and are there issues that we care about within those news stories that we'd care to have an opinion on, and we talk about that. Sometimes we look at those stories and say, well, there's really not an issue here that we want to issue an opinion on, but a lot of times we do, and so then we come to some sort of consensus on what our opinion is, and then one of us is assigned to write about it.
I remember in the old days there used to be a lot of meetings on what makes front page news. And I don't know if I can even answer that after years of wondering what makes front page news. I was touched just in the last few weeks where Nigeria had so many deaths and murders. But we didn't hear about that because of what was happening in France. And how does the press balance? How do journalism people make those decisions?
I think that's a good question, and I think that you try to determine what will impact people, what will impact them emotionally and personally, and what's important to them. And that's what you put on the front page. The example you give, though, is worthy of a whole different discussion, and that is the impact of fewer reporters who are out there investigating and learning news and reporting it. And so you have a certain number of reporters in Europe and a certain number of reporters in Africa. And I think that that's a serious problem that we have to deal with. We do not have as many reporters who are out gathering news as often as we did. And not only that, we don't have, at least in traditional media, print, radio, television, as much capacity for that, either because readers or listeners aren't interested in it, and you want to try to keep an audience, or because the amount of time devoted to news is diminished. And so there certainly are outlets for learning that news, and that's part of some of the nonprofit news organizations like Iowa Watch who exist around the world. But that's the real problem, that we've lost foreign correspondents, we've lost reporters and editors who are trying to develop these stories and report what's going on in multiple parts of the world.
Would that be because of something to do with the rise of social media? That there's more people reporting there and they're moving to the digital press rather than the on-hands reporting, being local, being involved in the scenes?
It has to do with loss of revenue. So news organizations don't have the news budgets that they used to have, and that's because the media companies either don't have the revenue that they used to have, or they've shifted their paradigm on how much they're willing to devote to news and product development versus how much they want to earn at the executive level or at the shareholders level.
Well, there's always the question of whether American news consumers care as much about international news as they should, or whether they're mainly concerned with domestic news. There's always, every once in a while, a story will come out where someone will compare like news magazine covers, and the Time magazine, the European edition will have some African crisis on the cover, and the American edition will have like a movie star or something like that, and people will say, see, this means that Americans don't care about what's happening in the world. I'm not sure that's true, but everybody's under such budget pressures, like Lyle's talking about, that you need to sort of focus your resources, and a lot of news organizations have concluded that overseas bureaus and a lot of the expensive stuff that they used to have isn't worth it to their readership.
I imagine danger and safety for the reporters has something to do with the changes in how it's reported too, because we can embed reporters now like in a war zone, but they're under the protection of a bigger unit with the military. But to just go to Nigeria and where there's mass
Well,
killing
actually,
and
embedding
kidnapping.
reporters is a policy by the Pentagon to recover from Vietnam, when reporters could go wherever they wanted and actually produce reports that the Pentagon didn't want reported in a war that we were not doing as well as we were being told we were doing. I think one consideration is about differences in your European contrast is a good one, is maybe to ask the question, whose news? Because when we send Western white male reporters to different parts of the world, they see through their particular perspectives. They see with their own eyes. And diversity in the press is important, and there is scholarship that shows that it really depends on who's reporting the news and what sorts of cultural and social schemas get noticed and get privileged. Africa is a particularly stark example of that sort of, I won't say indifference, but it's a subjective notion of what counts as news.
Interesting. One of the things that concerns me about some things I see on visual news reporting, such as on the TV shows, is where they put out images that don't belong to me, to anybody yet. They're just public images, say, of a car accident. And people seem to care about that because it does grab you, it grabs the attention. But I worry about the invasion of privacy with some of these things. Let me give you an example. I moved to Colorado a few years ago, and they zoomed in on a car accident where they reported there was a death. And it was the same model as my husband's car. And I hadn't heard from him that day, and I thought, how can we be so public with private news when they hadn't even identified the family yet, but they were telling that there was a death in the car accident? So how do people make decisions, whether it's funding or availability, or I worry about that taking over the news.
There are television stations in Los Angeles that will interrupt their repeated sitcoms in order to air police chases. And it's a kind of pit sport where the outcome of the chase is likely to be violent. And so that's sensationalism. That's not journalism.
But it's on the news.
You know, there's a dark saying that if it bleeds, it leads. And it's because audiences want that. So the ethical question becomes for the newsroom is, at what length do we go to that border or that boundary of what the audience wants? Because audiences want a lot of things that we wouldn't put in a newscast versus what is news and what's information. So if there's a car accident and it's bunched up traffic at 5 o'clock at night and you go home and it's 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock and you want to know what happened out there and your news station isn't telling you, the news station is letting you down as well. So there's that fine line that you have to deal with there as you're reporting public matters, public safety matters in that instance, something that may have impacted
But when
people.
does the thought of no harm to the individual and invading their privacy come in something like that?
Well, I think that's the ethical question you have to ask. And so we try to be careful, or it depends on the news media organization. I don't want to, you know, this is not a monolithic industry, right? It's run by people who live in a democracy, who get to make decisions about what's news and what's not without prior restraint. And so we make decisions. And so, you know, a good guide would be, has it impacted the public in some way? And what is the public's value in knowing this? Is it because there was, in the incidents you're talking about, because there was an accident, someone died? You know, judgments get made along the way at each of those things. I will say this, that a lot of times for television stations, the accident is easy to cover because it's an easy visual. And television needs to have visual news. But the test would be as if you're able to relate that incident into something that impacts the public and its notion of what society expects from us, and has that changed.
And my question then, in that one sensational instance I gave you as an example, was where's the harm to the stakeholder? And I know that's one of the standards too that you have to always hold up. Is there harm to the stakeholder in what is being reported?
Sure. I mean, there's a consideration about the person's privacy, and so one of the news values that journalists at least implicitly pay attention to is the prominence of the person involved, or the person's celebrity. A traffic accident involving an otherwise unknown citizen of the metropolitan area is not the same as a traffic accident involving someone who's got a very prominent place in the community.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, as Lyle was saying, as you've said, I mean, your job runs into other people's lives when you're a journalist, and the privacy issue is always delicate. I mean, as a reporter, before I was a columnist, I would have to call the families of people who, soldiers who were killed overseas, or people who died in crimes or accidents, and that's one of the toughest things you have to do. And some people are very upset that you even try, but I mean, that's part of the story, and so that you have to try to do that, as distasteful as it can be sometimes.
And sometimes it just can't be, and maybe it's not always like that, and we hope for the best.
But I think a lot of people are surprised, though, Todd, that journalists are empathic. I mean, they're...
Yeah, we don't get, I mean, look at the way we're portrayed in sort of movies and things, where it's kind of one-dimensional characters.
Kind of hard-hearted, and
Right.
the notion of being objective is being unfeeling, and I don't know anyone like that.
Well,
Not in the
the press has such an influence on our culture, and the press has such an influence on our language and everything else that happens, that it's good to hear that you're not just there, that you do follow through and that you do investigate. And we're coming to a conclusion now, so what would you say is some of the best things in a nutshell as to close our program with that is happening with the press these days?
I think more people are interested in news now than at any other time, and that's why it's important to do a fair and honest way of reporting that. I also think that if you think about it in a newspaper or a newscast, it's remarkable how many things are correct. And so this is the one industry in the world that if you're 99.9% correct, you still think you're a failure because of that 0.1%. And so of all of the thousands and thousands of words that are said in a newscast or in a newspaper, the fact that so much of it is accurate on such a short deadline is quite remarkable.
Thank you.
Well, tonight, the President's just given his State of the Union address, and I want to point out that journalism remains the site where we continue to argue about how we're going to be a democratic society. And it's a place for consensus, it's a place for conflict, it's a place for a lot of civilized messiness. And I think that's a very important way to think about journalism.
Civilized messiness.
Yeah, exactly. For all the pressures of budgets and the speed of social media and the sort of the bite-sized journalism that we see, I still think that there's incredible capacity for telling complicated stories and explaining things. I think Iowa Watch is a really good example of great things that are happening. And I think as long as we've got folks out there that are willing to teach the next generation of journalists like you and you are, I think there's going to be a bright future despite all of the sort of changes and transformations that we're going through.
So, and there are a lot of changes, and they're coming quickly. Almost can't keep up with them. But as the news business attempts to look at all the changes in television and social media, you still have the standards to hold on. The moral and ethic responsibilities, morality, fairness, journalistic competence, standards of objectivity, accuracy, avoiding bias, as you mentioned earlier, avoiding harm. And I'm glad to know that we have people like you that are working hard on all of those things. But I also firmly believe not only in those items with the press, but I believe the public has a responsibility in news endeavors too. And we didn't talk too much about that, it was mentioned. I think the public has to listen with a critical ear and shift from emotional responses and seeking sensationalism to actually looking at various attempts. So I hope in this broadcast this morning that we've shared some new news and some ways to look at the news. And I thank you panelists for your informative discussion this night, and I thank you viewers for being with us. I'm Martha Rogers on behalf of the Lynn County Interreligious Council, and I ask you to remember, live ethically. Goodbye now.